Well, it's windy, it's afternoon, so let's look at one of the big questions. Divine authority, original sin, and unlimited power. I'll repeat it again. The trifecta. Divine authority, original sin, and unlimited power. You would have expected in the 21st century, after almost 7,000 years of urbanisation, that we would understand inherently the important issues which are raised when power is concentrated in the hands of a few people and possibly in the hands of one person. So I think we need to look historically at why we have come to this arrangement as human beings. Obviously not all human beings have the same arrangement. Many societies or groups or communities pre-urbanisation relied on consensus decision making, may not have had divine rulers, and were forced to cooperate and share limited resources. But urbanisation changed the nature of humanity. And if you look at all civilizations, whether it's South American civilizations, Asian civilizations, European civilizations, African civilizations, and even civilizations in the Pacific, people who are able to exercise power claimed that they had a divine right, that some type of God, some type of supernatural entity gave them the right to exercise power over people. And what we saw is the creation of social structures and physical structures which concentrated power in the hands of a minuscule minority. And this minuscule minority normally relied on the concept of divine intervention. But somehow, some type of deity, whether it was an Egyptian pharaoh or a South American high priest, that somehow this divine authority gave them the power to exercise authority. Now if we look at early Christian teachings and even look at the Old Testament, it's important to understand that through the history of Abraham and Sarah, the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, the concept of original sin has been central to the type of communities that were created and to the justifications that were made to concentrate power in the hands of a minuscule minority. Because original sin is the concept that when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, they fell from God's grace. And that meant they were prone to sin. Murder, rape, theft, you name it. Because they had lost God's grace. Now, some Christian authorities in the 4th and 5th century modified this to say if somebody was baptized, there would be less original sin, but they were still prone to original sin. So in a society where you have inequality, especially inequality in power and wealth, you have tension. You have tension between the rulers and the mechanisms they use to maintain their authority. And their call to a divine authority is central to their position in society, in their ability to exercise absolute power. We see this today in absolute monarchies like in Saudi Arabia. Now ultimately, concentration of power is determined on an ability to use violence. And in societies where the ability to exercise violence is concentrated in the state as we have today, we see that the concentration of power becomes extraordinary. Now, what happened recently in the last few weeks or so in South Korea, where martial law was declared because there was an impasse in Parliament with the Prime Minister, highlights how easy it is, even in a so-called representative democracy, for power to be concentrated. We saw this with the election of Mr. Trump, you know, the great confabulator in the United States of America, where the party that he represents now control the presidency, the Congress, the Senate, and most important of all, the Supreme Court. So those checks and balances which were created by the founding fathers of the United States of America are now no longer in force. And it's no wonder that in the 21st century we see the atrocities which are occurring, whether it's the atrocities in the Ukraine, whether it's atrocities in Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank, Palestine. The fact is that although we may have a representative democracy, the fact is that power is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. If you look at the major population centres in the world today, India, China, the United States, Indonesia, all those societies, although four of them say the representative democracies, all those societies have concentrated power in the hands of an individual or a small clique who can then mobilise the forces at their disposal to maintain that power. So what's the justification? Well, the justification that has been used over and over and over again is that if human beings are left to themselves, what we have is chaos. Because human beings are incapable, because of original sin or because of divine intervention, of actually ruling themselves without centralised structures. It's not about not having any rulers, but it's about having institutional structures which allow people to make decisions which suit their particular situation. It's no accident that representative democracies in 2024, 2025 are on the nose in so many countries around the world. And the election of the great confabulator is a prime example of what happens when the state, when those who concentrate wealth in their hands have an impact on the state apparatus, because the two go together: concentration of wealth and concentration of power. It's no accident that old adage that absolute power corrupts absolutely is something that has always been part and parcel of human history since the urbanisation phase began. So the dilemma we face today is, why in the 21st century do we find so many dictators or pseudo-dictators having profound impacts on the lives of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people? And the fact is, the institutional structures that we have created to govern us are now being used to exploit and oppress us. When the state or individual has a monopoly on the use of force, that monopoly is what gives them power. In Syria today, we see the unravelling of the Assad regime, not by one or two oppositions, but multiple oppositions that have seized the vacuum that's been created in Syria with the defeat of Hezbollah and Russian intervention in Syria decreasing dramatically because of their own problems in the Ukraine. So this is the issue. It's about power. How can we let power be concentrated in such few hands? How can one individual have such a profound impact? Look at the behaviour of the war criminal who is the Prime Minister of Israel. Where atrocities are occurring in the 21st century, which we haven't seen since World War II. These are so-called representative democracies, where leaders are elected by people. The centralisation of power is the pathway to destruction and chaos. And it's the pathway to destruction and chaos because the more that power is concentrated, the more the monopoly on the use of violence the state apparatus has, the greater the cost to those who resist that concentration of power. Whether it's soft power for a representative democracy or hard power through a hereditary monarch, as we see, with absolute power, as we see in Saudi Arabia. So what has let us down as human beings is not original sin. It's not divine intervention. It's not divine authority. It's the fact that with urbanisation and the growth of cities, states, we have outsourced our responsibility to govern ourselves to a small clique, hoping that small clique can use the power of the state to protect us from invasion and from internal chaos. But the reality is, the greater the concentration of power, the greater the concentration of power in the 21st century, the greater the threat. We have powerful political leaders supported and financed by the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and a fourth of state that has lost its way, gets either controlled by the state or the corporate sector. We have a situation in 2021 because of technological innovation which puts each and everyone at risk. We saw the destruction in World War I, where over 26 million people died. We saw the destruction in World War II, where over 50 million people died. We see in the destruction in Gaza, an area that's half the size of Melbourne, where 2 million people have been subjected to one of the most brutal attacks in human history. We see this every day. We see the election of a great confabulator who has his finger on the ability to create carnage around the world. We see the Turkish Prime Minister unleashing his forces on Kurds who've been fighting for independence for over 70 years. We see the Indian Prime Minister using the power which is inherent in his office, promote Hindu nationalism at the expense of significant minorities in India. We see the leader of the Chinese Communist Party use the monopoly on violence they enjoy to create a totalitarian state where every time you walk out of your house There is facial recognition technology to keep an eye on people if they need to be kept an eye on. We see these people having extraordinary powers. We see Vladimir Putin continue his war in the Ukraine, irrespective of the loss of life both in Russia and the Ukraine. But most importantly of all in this country today, we see that the drums of war are beating and the population, the Australian population, is being mobilised to think we are going to be involved in a clash of civilization between freedom and slavery. Ultimately, it's not a struggle between freedom and slavery. It's a struggle regarding the centralisation of power. The greater the centralisation of power in a technological age, the greater the centralisation of power in the digital age, the greater the damage that can be caused by the exercise of that power. 1,000 years ago, you'd have kings go out on the battlefield. You'd have generals leading their armies. Today, we have people either self-appointed or elected to office who have never seen brutality, but every day order the instruments of war to create the most create brutality across the globe. The difference in 2024-25 is Australia is no longer isolated. We are part of the world. Our geographical isolation is no longer relevant. Any city in this country can be targeted by any leader who is able to exercise absolute power. And in such a situation you would think that we would be part of a non-aligned movement, a movement which allows the Russias, the Chinas and the United States of the world to battle it out amongst themselves. But no, in Australia, because of our great fear of our neighbours, we have elected to hang on to the coattails of Uncle Sam, led by the great confabulator. Our military forces are totally integrated into the US military forces. US military forces man bases in this country. Thousands of US troops are in this country constantly. The foreign bases, US bases that are here, are used to conduct war in the Middle East. So this concentration of power does not help anyone. All it does is put us in the firing line. It's time we looked at different mechanisms of organising ourselves. Instead of putting our faith, our eggs, all in the one basket, in the representative democracy basket, a basket which is manipulated by that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. It's time that we looked at alternative methods of making decisions, of breaking down hierarchy, of looking at direct democracy as an alternative, of discussing the issue of citizens-initiated referendums. So citizens have the capacity to make decisions, so that not all decisions are made by whoever controls the state at a particular time. So we are in a period of increasing difficulty. We are in a period where power is being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And in a digital age where we have instant communication and instant mutual destruction, this is an exceptionally dangerous policy to pursue and support. If you're interested in looking at things in a different way, interested in talking about creating a society where the Commonwealth is used for the common good, and where the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication are owned by the community as a whole, then I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interest. Because ultimately, the way the human race is going, it's only divine intervention which will save us.